The letter came on an evening as gray as ash, with no sender's name and no return address. It was written in uneven, spidery script on thick, yellowed paper, and bore a simple request. The keeper's post at Black Marrow Point is vacant. Your services are needed at once. Pay is provided in advance. Do not delay. I should have ignored it. I didn't know who had sent it, nor why they had chosen me. Yet something in those words rooted themselves in my thoughts. My life was uneventful, bleak even. A lighthouse keeper's solitude, with no one around to prod at my failures, seemed almost appealing. By midnight, I was on a small ferry headed for Black Marrow Point. The lighthouse rose from the jagged coast like a severed finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Its windows, dark and uninviting, stared down at me as the ferry approached. Even the boatman, a gnarled man who smelled of salt and seaweed, was reticent as he helped me ashore. "Don't stay too long," he said gruffly, before pushing off into the churning waves without another word. I stood at the foot of the lighthouse, my suitcase heavy in one hand. The wind carried the faint tang of salt and rot, and the cliffs around me felt unnaturally sharp, almost hostile. A small path lined with dying seagrass led up to the lighthouse door. The wood was splintered, the brass knob green with corrosion. The key was under the mat, just as the letter had promised. I turned it with some effort, and the door groaned open, revealing a dim interior. A single oil lamp flickered on the table, casting long shadows across the peeling walls. The air smelled damp, tinged with a faint but unmistakable scent of decay. On the far side of the room was a trapdoor, half concealed beneath a moth-eaten rug. And there, on the table beside the lamp, lay the logbook. Its leather cover was cracked, the edges singed as though it had been too close to a fire. I flipped through its brittle pages. Most of the entries were mundane, weather reports, inventory lists, until the final one. Do not light the lamp. The days passed quietly at first. I busied myself cleaning the lantern room, which sat atop a dizzying spiral staircase. The machinery for the massive Fresnel lens was old but serviceable, though the controls felt stiff and unyielding under my fingers. I didn't dare test them, not after the warning in the logbook. Still, something about the place felt wrong. The silence, while expected, seemed unnaturally heavy. At night, I would sit in the quarters, the oil lamp casting weak light as the wind howled outside. Yet, as the hours crept past, the wind's voice began to change. It whispered now, faint words I couldn't quite make out. Then came the tapping. It started on the second night, a rhythmic sound against the windows, soft but persistent. I dismissed it as branches or stray debris carried by the wind, but when I ventured outside the next morning, I found no trees or debris near the lighthouse. On the third night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. My nerves frayed as I lay awake in the small cot, clutching the blanket to my chest. I wasn't alone, I realized. Something, or someone, was out there. It was on that night that I found the trapdoor again. My curiosity overpowered my unease, and I moved the rug aside to inspect it more closely. The wood was darker than the surrounding floorboards, as though it had absorbed years of moisture, or something else. The hinges were thick with rust, and there was no visible latch or handle. I pressed my ear to it, but the only sound was the steady pounding of my own heartbeat. That was when I heard the moan. It came from the sea, distant at first, but rising in pitch and volume. A sound unlike any animal or machine, it carried with it a sense of hunger, of longing. I rushed to the nearest window and peered out. Shapes began to emerge in the mist. At first, they seemed like shadows cast by the moon, but the longer I watched, the more they took form. Tall, elongated figures with glowing eyes like embers. They drifted closer, their movement slow but purposeful. Panic surged. I grabbed the logbook, desperate for answers. Flipping to the last pages, I found a hastily scribbled note. The light awakens them. Never light the lamp. My eyes darted to the unlit beacon above. Was it already too late? I slammed the logbook shut, its brittle pages crackling in protest. My hands shook as I clutched it to my chest. The moaning outside grew louder, more insistent, and I realized the shapes were no longer in the mist. They were in the water, their outlines sharper now, wading through the frothing waves as if the sea itself recoiled from their presence. The lighthouse felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Every groan of the beams, every creak of the spiral staircase above seemed amplified, as though the building were straining to contain something ancient and malevolent. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with panic. What had I done by coming here? What had I awakened? I forced myself to move, clutching the logbook like a talisman as I bolted to the lantern room. The ascent was punishing, my legs aching as I climbed the steep stairs. The air grew colder the higher I went, the temperature plunging unnaturally with each step. When I finally reached the top, I stopped short, frozen by what I saw. The Fresnel lens, dormant and silent since my arrival, was now humming faintly. A pale, flickering glow pulsed from its center like a heartbeat. Yet, I hadn't touched the lever to light it. The moaning was closer now, a discordant symphony that vibrated through the walls. I peered out the wide glass windows and saw them. More figures than I could count, emerging from the sea. Their faces were indistinct, rippling like reflections in disturbed water, and their limbs were too long, bending unnaturally as they dragged themselves onto the jagged rocks. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. The logbook's cryptic warnings haunted me. The light awakens them. Never light the lamp. But the lamp was already stirring. Its dim glow grew brighter, the machinery whirring softly as if awakening from a long slumber. I didn't know how to stop it. I had no choice but to retreat. Descending the staircase was harder now. My legs felt leaden, and the air carried a sickly, sweet smell that made me gag. When I reached the quarters, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of dread. The trapdoor was no longer flush with the floor. It was ajar, revealing a thin sliver of blackness beneath. Cold air seeped from the gap, carrying with it a sound, a low, guttural growl that resonated deep in my bones. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee the lighthouse and leave whatever horrors lay beneath undisturbed. But there was nowhere to go. Outside, the figures were closing in. Their inhuman cries filled the night, and the mist thickened, swirling around the lighthouse as if it were alive. I needed answers. The logbook hadn't given me enough. The trapdoor was the only clue left. With trembling hands, I grabbed the crowbar from the corner and pried the door open. It gave way with a groan, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness. The stench hit me first, thick, cloying, metallic. It clung to my throat, making me gag as I fumbled for the oil lamp. The flame sputtered weakly, barely penetrating the blackness below. I steeled myself and descended, each step feeling like a descent into the grave. At the bottom was a cavernous chamber, its walls slick with moisture and strange carvings that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. In the center of the room stood an altar, hewn from black stone. On it rested a lantern, smaller than the one in the beacon above, but emanating the same faint, pulsing glow. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the chamber. It came from the lantern itself, the light within it twisting and writhing like a living thing. I stepped closer, compelled by a mixture of terror and fascination. The carvings around the altar were unlike anything I'd seen, spiraling glyphs that seemed to shift when I looked away. One phrase, repeated over and over, caught my eye. "The Keeper seals the light." The words chilled me to the core. The Keeper seals the light. Was that why I had been summoned here? To do something the last Keeper had failed, or refused, to do. The pulsing lantern on the altar seemed to respond to my presence, its glow intensifying. The growling shifted, becoming a chorus of whispers that slithered through my mind. "Take it." I recoiled, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Outside, the cries of the creatures reached a fever pitch. I could hear them battering against the lighthouse walls now, clawing at the doors and windows. The structure shuddered under the assault. I had no choice. My options were rapidly dwindling. The carvings on the walls seemed to writhe, their meaning pressing into my mind like a blade. The lantern was both the source of the light and the key to sealing it. With a deep breath, I reached out and grasped the lantern's handle. It burned cold, the sensation like frostbite spreading through my fingers. The whispers became screams and a blinding pain shot through my skull. Images flooded my mind, cyclopean ruins beneath the sea, creatures with eyes like black stars, and a swirling void that seemed to hunger for everything. I stumbled back, clutching the lantern as its glow intensified. The figures outside screamed in unison, their voices a cacophony of rage and despair. They began to dissolve, their forms unraveling like mist in the wind. The lantern grew heavier in my hands, its light pulsating erratically. I staggered toward the altar, guided by instinct more than thought. Raising it high, I smashed it against the stone. The light flared once, blinding and searing before extinguishing. The cavern plunged into total darkness, and for a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, faintly, I heard the crashing of waves above. When I climbed back to the surface, the mist was gone, and the sky was beginning to lighten. The lighthouse was silent, the beacon dark, but the unease in my chest remained. Had I truly sealed the light, or had I merely delayed the inevitable? The morning sun rose weakly, casting pale, trembling rays over Black Marrow Point. The mist was gone, and the sea lay unnaturally still, its surface as smooth and reflective as glass. But the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too deliberate, like the world itself was holding its breath. I stood at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at its cracked and weathered facade. Its windows were empty, lifeless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from within. My legs trembled, exhaustion weighing me down like lead, but I couldn't bring myself to linger any longer. My hands were raw from gripping the crowbar and carrying the shattered remains of the lantern. The blackened shards lay bundled in my satchel, each fragment humming faintly, as though the light hadn't truly died. I considered throwing them into the sea, but the thought filled me with dread. What if that act unleashed something worse? The ferry wasn't due until midday, so I followed the narrow trail leading away from the lighthouse. The air was cold despite the sunlight, and the cliffs seemed sharper now, their jagged edges slicing into the horizon. As I walked, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The creatures, the glowing eyes, the whispers. But it was the voice that lingered most, a low, guttural echo that spoke not in words, but in meaning. You are Keeper. When I finally reached the small jetty where the ferry was to dock, I found the old boatman waiting. His face was grave, his eyes scanning me with something between pity and fear. He didn't speak as I climbed aboard, and I was grateful for the silence. As the ferry pulled away from Black Marrow Point, I felt a strange relief, though it was tempered by an unshakable unease. I kept my gaze fixed on the horizon, refusing to look back. Yet, In the periphery of my vision, I thought I saw the beacon flicker once. By the time I reached the mainland, the world felt different, more hollow, as if a thin veil separated me from reality. I checked my pocket absently and froze. The unmarked letter was there again, though I had left it behind in the lighthouse. Its surface was pristine, the script fresh. The keeper is chosen. I tore it apart and flung the pieces into the wind, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. As I walked away, I caught my reflection in a shop window. My face was pale, my eyes sunken. And behind me, faintly, impossibly, I thought I saw the outline of the lighthouse, shrouded in mist, waiting.